Hello and welcome to the Business of Data show. Today we'll be talking with Fred Deletta from Domino's and Katia Walsh from Levi Strauss & Co. Hello there, my name is Catherine and I'm the Content and Community Manager here within the Business of Data team at Cranium. It's a pleasure to have you joining us today. Driven by our global connected network, Cranium inspires data and analytics senior leaders to drive efficiency and innovation and follow proven paths to success. The Business of Data show is just one of the many formats that we showcase thought-leading insights from senior data and analytics executives. In each episode, we'll discuss the latest industry news and research and explore the hottest topics, challenges and opportunities. On that note, we'd love to hear from you. If you have thoughts, questions, or perhaps a topic you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please do email them over to the bod@craniumgroup.com. Right, let's get this show on the road, shall we? Today, we are zeroing in on data ethics. Just as the title says, the good, the bad, and the ugly as well. Now, data ethics shot to the top of the data agenda in 2020, with more organizations than ever before harnessing the power of advanced analytics and AI. The question of how to do so ethically and in the customer's best interest has become a burning issue. With one eye on the data misuse scandals that hit the press last year, we ask, why are data and analytics AI leaders only focusing on this now? What must they do to get their data ducks in a row? And how are ethics frameworks, explainable AI, diversity initiatives and more helping organizations to mitigate risks whilst maximizing the value of their data assets? Now, my first leader joining me in the studio today joins me from the great state of lakes. Of course, I'm talking about Michigan. It's my pleasure to be joined by Fred Deletta, who is the Senior Director of Enterprise Data Intelligence for Domino's. Thanks for joining me, Fred. Hi, Fred. Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Catherine. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm so glad I got you on this episode, Fred, because I'm really keen to put a few questions to you all about ethics today. And I'll start off by framing it with some recent research that we conducted. Now, 93% of our respondents of the C-level data and analytics say that ethical considerations represent a barrier to AI adoption within their organizations. Why do you think that ethics has risen up the data agenda so quickly over the past 12 months?
Yeah, that's an interesting question and interesting research. So first of all, I would say that kind of the ethics question probably goes beyond AI adoption or barriers to AI adoption. I think it probably has to be part of your foundational fabric in terms of data strategy and activation in general. But if you look at kind of from a consumer domain and you look at kind of the personalization capabilities that we now have in our toolkit, it's really kind of deployed a lot around programmatic use of kind of customer 360 engines. So really AI and machine learning really are amplifying kind of what is happening in terms of automation increases the level of interactions that you potentially have across channels and campaigns. So it really requires somewhat of an oversight as well in order to avoid drift versus the intent.
Absolutely. And I think that's really interesting what you say there, that it does go wider than just AI as well. What would be your advice to folk who are just starting out on this journey? Perhaps they haven't got that infrastructure of ethics built in. Where would you say they should start?
I think always kind of an interesting start or perspective is really taking an outside-in look in terms of kind of what are your customer expectations of the brand, basically. So how are you as a brand relevant in terms of value add and meeting their expectations? And then really have that trickle down to everything you do in terms of data and advanced analytics. That would be my recommendations to start with.
Brilliant. Now, I have heard the phrase from several thought leaders that just because you can doesn't mean you should when it comes to ethics. Is this a sort of phrase that you would go by as well? How do you set those parameters for what you deem ethical and what you deem okay to go on and do?
Yeah, it's probably kind of a good idea as well to kind of structure a framework around kind of based upon your organizational context, especially in the kind of the B2C domain and your brand values. What is kind of the definition around it and kind of the criteria that you want to kind of approach it with. So I think that's probably the first step.
Fantastic. Now, what has Domino's been doing to ensure it uses data ethically and in its customers' best interest? And it's really interesting that you say about this brand perception. What do you think your customers see when they look at Domino's, and how do you then respond with that data use?
So first of all, I would say kind of clearly there's a lot of disruption happening, a lot of emerging and changing trends, and also customer behaviors are changing quite a bit. We've seen it as well as part of COVID. So it's really kind of understanding, again, from the customer centricity, basically, what are they kind of expecting from user brands, and kind of how can you make sure that in every engagement with your customer, actually you're relevant in terms of messaging, in terms of addressing that need from an individual perspective.
Now, to me, that sounds like quite a fluid thing. Customer expectation, as you say, over the last year, demand has changed massively. So what are you doing to stay up to date and keeping your finger on the pulse with ethics? I mean, times change. So many companies now are far more digitalized. So maybe expectations has. So what are you doing to really understand your customers' change in perhaps what they are more happy for you to do now that they perhaps wouldn't have been a couple of years ago?
So yeah, clearly kind of trying to understand a lot of the macroeconomics changes, etc. is something that we need to be very proactively about. If you see kind of even before COVID, I think the stay-at-home economy and kind of the delivery expectations from the customers was kind of already kind of trending towards that expectation. So it's almost how can you preempt and actually deploy a strategy to make sure that you stay as close to the expectations of the customer, and then build your entire kind of ecosystem around that to have that customer delight, and moreover kind of a very frictionless kind of user experience in terms of how they kind of interact with your brand.
Brilliant. Now, Fred, my last question to you. On a previous episode of the Business of Data show, we were talking about business being aligned with data analytics. Do you ever find yourself having cross conversations with the business where they really want you to do this thing, but actually you're a little concerned about the ethics? Or do they, on the large part, understand those data ethic concerns?
Yeah, I think it's important that kind of for any initiative basically that you're pursuing, where kind of data is an integral part of it, and the activation part is there's a very blended approach in terms of understanding what are the business outcomes or the impact that you're trying to achieve, whether it's customer experience or something else, but really making sure that you go in tandem with kind of the business partners. I think that's kind of as in the initiation and strategy to execution. So I think that's mission critical.
Fantastic. Fred, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Happy to do so.
Thank you so much, Fred. Goodness me, hearing from Domino's always makes me so hungry. Now, my second thought leader who is joining me today to chat all things ethics is Katia Walsh, who is the Chief Global Strategy and AI Officer for Levi Strauss & Co. Now, last year in 2020, Katia was named one of our top 100 global innovators in data analytics. Hi, Katia. How are you doing today?
Hello, Catherine. I'm very well, thank you.
Thank you for joining me so early in the morning for you, but I'm so glad we have you on today. Brilliant.
It's my pleasure. And we work at all hours. Levi Strauss is a global company with offices all over the world. So I work Shanghai time, I work European time, and I work San Francisco time.
Well, I'm so glad to hear it because, like I say, I'm so glad I have you on today. Now, let's dive straight into it, Katia. And I'm going to reference this question with some research that we did because I feel like it's always good to start there. Now, within a study the Business of Data conducted, 47% of our respondents say they have built debiasing steps into their model development process, whilst 41% rely on third parties to ensure their models are ethical and unbiased. What are your thoughts on these figures? Are enterprises doing enough to ensure data is being used ethically?
Well, first of all, I love numbers and figures, obviously, but these particular numbers are somewhat irrelevant, regardless of my high respect for the business of data and everything you're doing for our community and the world. And the reason that these numbers are not relevant is because you can never do enough in ethics. It is the most important tenet that a company needs to emphasize. If you're not doing the right thing as an organization for consumers, for your customers, for your employees, for society, for shareholders, then you shouldn't be in business. So even if those numbers get to 100%, we would still be happy that we're making progress, but we should not be content. And there are a number of things that companies can and should be doing proactively, regardless of whether regulation requires them to do so or not, to debias the outcomes of data and artificial intelligence. There are three types of methods in which a company can minimize. It can never completely eradicate bias. Bias is just part of life. I wrote my dissertation 150 years ago about objectivity and the fact that there wasn't any. So objectivity is the lack of bias by definition. However, we owe it to ourselves, to our society, and to our future consumers and the future of our companies to do our very best to eradicate bias or minimize bias. So we start with diversity of people, because it's humans that create the models from data and the outcomes of artificial intelligence. If teams that work on those models are not diverse themselves, then inherently, by definition, by default, the outcomes that come from this data from the models will also be biased. So diversity of people, and I don't mean just gender, which is of course important, or racial diversity or ethnic diversity, also very important, but I also mean perspectives, backgrounds, ways of thinking, ways of seeing things. So diversity of people is very important, and we are very lucky in the data community, in the data world, that people in this world come from all kinds of backgrounds, certainly engineering and artificial intelligence and virtual agents and computer science. But in my teams in various companies all over the world, I've had physicists, chemists, social scientists, statisticians, philosophers, poker players, wow, rocket scientists, writers. So you want this kind of diversity so that you really have the best, richest models and the best perspectives that you can engender. So diversity of people is very important. Diversity of data sources, also critical. We're so lucky to be living in this time when there's so much data at our fingertips. And we have to harness all these data sources, internal data, structured data, transactions, interactions, of course, but also images, sensor data from delivery tracks. Anything that can be digitized becomes data. This jacket can be a piece of data as well. So we have to harness all these various sources of data and use them. And the diversity of that data will also minimize the bias that can be inherent in our models. And of course, there's diversity of tools. So much is developing so quickly. In the few minutes we've already spoken, there have been new tools developed, a lot of them open source, so much innovation, and that is inherently the mother. Innovation is the mother of diversity and the way in which to minimize bias. I hope this gives a sense for how we can tackle this.
Absolutely, and I really love that three-pronged approach there, and especially the mention of the diversity of thought. I feel like that one tends to get left towards the end, and I mean, you can try and get diversity on gender, and then something else might fall off the plate, and you're trying to get a diverse team. But actually, diversity of thought is a fantastic place to start to make sure you are getting as diverse a team as possible. And as you say, the more perspectives at the table, the more you're building these naturally into the models as well. Brilliant. Now, my next question to you is, how do you manage the ethics of using customer data to provide more personalized experiences? And how should AI leaders ensure data is being used ethically and in their customers' best interests as well?
So I want to touch on something that I just mentioned, which is that data is everywhere. This jacket that I'm wearing right now has a Bluetooth in its cuff. And when I connect that, when I pair it with my phone, I can take a selfie, I can listen to music, I can listen to directions. Levi Strauss & Company developed this in a partnership with Google for people that like cycling, so that people could do these activities and still be active, particularly during lockdown now. It's very handy. It keeps people with an active lifestyle. This, of course, generates data. So data is everywhere. And when we gather that data, we can do so much with it. And this is where the big question comes to play. What do we do with this data? We use it to create a predictive, proactive, and personalized experience for each of our billions of customers all over the world. But we can only do that in a responsible way. At the end of the day, if you're not protecting your customers, you cannot delight them. You cannot delight your customers if you are not protecting them. So ethics is, again, the tenet of doing this. And data is always something that I firmly believe, and my company believes, and the world is now starting to also believe, luckily, that data is something that consumers own and control. Regulation is helping ensure that this control happens. I have been a big proponent of the General Data Protection Regulation in California, where Levi Strauss & Company is headquartered. There is also the California Consumer Privacy Act. This is just the beginning. We're going to see more and more of this regulation. In this field, innovators actually welcome regulation because it helps ensure that we do the right thing. With the great power of data comes the great responsibility of handling it correctly. So how do we do that? I talked about controls, I talked about regulation, but ethics is something that's beyond control. It goes beyond what is required. It's about doing the right thing. And you mentioned in the early conversation, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Yes, this is absolutely true, but we live by the motto of do the right thing. And very often, maybe the law allows it. Maybe to some people it even feels okay. But if it doesn't feel right, don't do it. And we have to firmly enforce that. And it starts again with the team and the people that you have. If you hire ethical people, you will have ethical outcomes. How do you screen for that? It's not easy, and there are all kinds of ways to do so, and I'm sure everyone makes mistakes once in a while. But when I look for great teams, that is the first thing I look for. So in that vein, let me share another three-pronged approach. I find that three-legged stools work really well. So how do we ensure ethics when we provide a predictive, proactive, and personalized experience to each of our billions of customers? One, through communication. We want to make sure that we communicate to our customers exactly what data we gather from them and what we use it for. And when we communicate that, we give them the control to determine whether we can use it, because it is their data. Now, why do we want their data? We would want it so that they get a targeted experience, so that it is something that's relevant to them. It is, if that's not important to our consumers, that's fine. We would not force that. So they're fully in control, and that communications ensures that. Communication inside the company is also very important. And when we talk with our stakeholders and my partners and business leaders around the company, we also make sure that we're very careful about what data we gather, how we store it, where it's accessed, and how it's being used. So I talked about communication. I talked about control. One additional example of control is that in any kind of data platform where we collect and store data, we actually go through a great deal of work and effort to depersonalize the data that is stored from consumers. There is no personally identifiable information that enters the platform. Legally, we could be allowed to store it. It's not a problem. Ethically, we don't want to do it because, again, we want to do the right thing. There are also very tight controls in terms of who has access to anywhere where data is stored. There's one thing about democratizing data. aggregated, fully anonymized, yes, everyone should have access to it. It's a whole other thing about who has control to data that
Absolutely.
And then the third thing, and the third C, is about a code of conduct. So there's communication, there's control, but on top of that, because we hire ethical people, we want to always make sure that they also abide by a code of conduct. Just like a Hippocratic oath for doctors, we actually have installed a code of conduct for everyone who works and deals with data in our company.
Brilliant. Katia, the one thing I always love about chatting with you is not only are you absolutely honest and transparent with your answers, but you always give such depth. So thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Wow, wasn't it great to hear those brilliant perspectives on data ethics? Certainly a hot topic right now, and certainly will continue to be in the future. I thought what was particularly of interest with this episode was the constant link back to the customer. I wasn't necessarily expecting that, so that was really, really very of interest to me. Next time around, we will be talking all about digital transformation and innovation. Just as we have done this time, we will be joined by expert thought leaders to help us deep dive into the challenges and opportunities. Do be sure to subscribe to the Business of Data YouTube channel, follow our page on LinkedIn, and of course, come over and visit us at the Business of Data platform for more great content, insights, and connections. As always, stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you next time.